Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Bootstrap section where we're going to be discussing forms. A quick note before we actually begin to dive straight into forms of Bootstrap, I want to talk about Bootstrap in general for just a little bit. Many students get intimidated by Bootstrap when they first approach it. They think they need to memorize all the classes that we cover in this section of the course. Now, that's actually certainly not the case. You want to think of this section more as a guide to the documentation and what's really possible with Bootstrap, not as an overview of things that you need to memorize. Even people who work with Bootstrap often or every day are going to be referencing the documentation a lot. What we really want to master here is the skill of gathering and applying information, not just memorizing information. Now let's continue on talking about forms. So Bootstrap comes with many default classes for forms. There's two really important ones that we're going to be covering here, and one of the first ones we're going to cover is a class called form group. So let's explore the various form components that we can use with Bootstrap, and we're going to be referencing the course notes quite a bit. So what I would suggest you do is to open up the part2_forms.html file that's under the Bootstrap folder. Okay, let's jump straight to our browser and to our editor to get started. Alright, so here I have my editor open as well as my browser, and if I refresh my HTML here, right now I have it linked. So in my browser, this HTML is linked, and it also already has the link to the CDN version of Bootstrap. There's an empty body. To get started, I just want to point out where we can find a lot of this information. If you go to getbootstrap.com, click on the CSS tab, and then click down here where it says Forms, it'll take you down to a basic example of forms. And we can see here that we need to wrap labels and controls in a .form-group for optimum spacing. And when it says dot there, it's just trying to tell you that it's a class. Remember, when we're dealing with CSS, we reference classes with that period or dot. So when you actually type in the class, it will just be form.group. You won't actually have that dot there. So let's see this example, explore it a little bit, and see what happens when we wrap everything with a form group class. So I will copy this, and there's actually a really nice copy to clipboard button there that you can just use. And I'm going to paste this into my HTML file, save it, and then check it out here in my browser. And we can see right now it stretches from end to end on everything. So what I can do to organize this so it looks a little nicer is put it all in a container class. And that's something we're going to be doing often when we use Bootstrap, is put everything in different container divs. So let's paste that there, the closing tab, and then grab this entire form and just input it a little more, or indent it a little more. All right, now that everything's in a container class, when I refresh, we can see it's a little nicely centered. So far it's looking pretty good. We have our email input, our password input, and we can see some more advanced inputs, things such as a choose file input. So if I click on choose file, we can see that it pops up something for me to choose file. Now right now we actually can't do anything with this because we haven't learned the backend technologies such as Django to actually accept that file and then do something with it. Here we can see just a checkbox and then the submit button. Now the key class I want to talk about with forms is this class form group. And what the class form group does is it puts spacing in between components of forms so that they look nicer and they just read a little better. So to show you what I mean by this, I'm going to just delete these divs for the first two, refresh, and pay attention to what happens to the spacing here for email address and password. You can see here that they begin to get a little closer. And when we were dealing with our own input forms for some of the previous projects, we saw that we were using tricks such as adding in a break or adding in an empty paragraph to get that margin spacing nice. But all that's taken care of for you in Bootstrap, I'm just doing Control-Z here, when you use the class form group. And then let me refresh here, and we can see the spacing is a little readable, more readable now, and especially between the actual blocks of the email address versus the password. These are just minor things that Bootstrap is helping you out with a lot by having those classes ready for you. And the next class I want to point out is this form control class that's in the input tags. So we have these input tags, and we give them this class form control. Let's explore what they do by actually just taking them out. So there's my form control. I've taken them out, and I refresh over here, and we can see that by taking out the form control on the input tags, basically we have what looks like almost normal HTML, or normal CSS styling, I should say. Let's show one of them on this password input just to see the difference. So with the form control tag, I can see that it's rounding the corners, it's making it stretch the container size, it's actually highlighting a little differently. you can see that the highlighting has a bit of a, almost like an alpha or a blur around the password box, versus email, there is highlighting there, but it's not as subtle. And those are really the two classes that are making the forms look nice for Bootstrap. It's the form group and form control tags, or classes, excuse me, that you're going to be using on the tags. The div tag for each form, that's the label and input, it should have the form group, and then each input should have the form control. Now let's explore just a few examples of various different inputs that you're going to be using on a form. So I'm going to delete this entire form and then add in things from the notes. So I'm copying and pasting from part2_forms. So let me copy and paste the email submission example. So here we have a label input, and we've actually already kind of explored this, but let's refresh. And this is a typical email address. So we have the email address, the email input, so this is where you would enter your email. And then you'll also notice that it says, we'll never share your email with anyone else. This is really common to have a little explanatory text underneath any input. A lot of times it's underneath the email address to give some sort of note like this. What we use for that is this small tag, and we give it the class form text muted. And it says whatever text you want to say behind that. So that small tag basically just says, okay, a small piece of text here. So it's not the same size as a paragraph. So that's another useful tip when you're dealing with forms, if you ever want to give a little note there for a particular aspect of the input form. So that's a email submission. Going to delete that. And then I want to put in the password submission. Not too much to see here. Let's save it and refresh. And here we can see a password submission. Again, we've already seen this with Bootstrap. Going to copy and paste the next component that I have in the notes, which is a drop-down select. So here we can see we have, the select form, and let's copy all this and indent it a little more just so it's more readable. Save it and refresh. And here we can see what a drop-down form looks like with Bootstrap. So with Bootstrap, you get this nice interface, and we can see that it actually expands to the entire width of the container. Again, there are ways to control that with CSS or just by editing the container itself, but this is what a drop-down menu looks like with Bootstrap. If we want multiple select options, let me show you what that looks like. That has also the class form control here. So I can copy and paste this, save it, refresh, and we can see here we can have multiple selections. So if I want to select multiple copies, I can do shift and click, and that's basically another example of something very similar to a drop-down, except now I can select multiple options. And the way you do that is you say select, just like we did last time, but now you say multiple. So just to reiterate from the last drop-down option, which I'm going to copy and paste here for you to see. The first one, if I save this and refresh, is just a single selection. If I want a drop-down where I can select multiple things, using shift or using control or command, what you end up doing is in the select tag, you add multiple. And that's just a keyword. Okay, so moving along, the couple more that I want to show you are the text area with Bootstrap. We can delete these and put it in. Text area, it's also taking the form control. I refresh this and we can see a nice text area, has those rounded corners, and has the ability for me to grab this and expand it. There's the file upload input. We actually saw that a little bit already, but let's paste that in from the notes. We can see that it's also taking the class, if we look here, form control -file. So that's another important thing to note. When you're dealing with type file input, you want to make sure it has the class form-control-file. And the example here also comes with that small tag that we've seen earlier, which is some placeholder block level for help. So this would say something like, oh, please input your resume or something like that. Then you click on choose file and it automatically pops this thing up. Great. And like I mentioned before, we don't know yet how to actually deal with something when we upload it. We still need to learn the actual backend technologies for that. Now there's two more I want to show you, two more examples, and that is radio button examples with Bootstrap. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to see a couple new tags that we haven't seen yet, and those are the field set tags. So if we come up here, we can see we have a field set tag, and it takes the class form group, and we also have a legend. So let's actually refresh this and see what that looks like. So here we can see radio buttons, and that's the legend tag that's making it look like this. And you can see, hopefully it's visible on your screen, but I have an underline here because it's a legend. And so we say option 1 is this and that, be sure to include why it's great. Option 2, option 3 is disabled. So if you want something to be disabled, again, that's option 3 over here. You just put in a disabled call right here, disabled. All right, so nothing too fancy going on here. You can just check that there's classes for each of these. So if you want it to be disabled, you can say form check disabled as the class here instead of just form check. So here we have the class form check, which is really commonly used for radio buttons and, as you may have guessed, check buttons. So we're going to put in a check button example here, copy and paste it from the notes, paste it, whoops, let's get rid of that field set and that division, paste it in here. So here we have class is form check, label is form check dash label. Let's refresh, see what this looks like. And here it just says, check me out. We can click, unclick, not much going on here. But if you wanted it, you can put in class form check. And that's really all there is to forms of Bootstrap. So let's copy this entire form from the notes and paste it in so we can see what something with a bunch of options would look like. So I'm going to copy and paste this. And I copied everything, including the form tag, so I will save that, refresh, and here I can see a really large form example. So I have my email, I can see the spacing is nice between the various inputs, there's my password, there's my example select, here's an example of multiple selects, here's my example text area, here's the choose file input, radio buttons, check me out, and then the submit button. And we can always color the submit button with different classes. So before we end this lecture, something I really want to stress here is that you do not have to memorize everything that I just went over. And if it seemed like I was just quickly going over many examples but not diving deep into them, that's exactly what we're doing for this section of the course. Bootstrap is just being able to see what's possible and being able to reference the documentation. So you have these notes available to you in your class notes. If you ever want to make a form with any of these, you can basically just copy and paste to your own needs. Or you can always just check out the documentation that has many examples. So here we see a basic example of a form, but we can do things like a focus state, disabled state, etc., validation states, inline forms. There's a lot of examples, and the documentation, it can be intimidating at first, but really it's all here to help you. It's just normal people referencing this and writing it, so don't ever be intimidated. And if you have any questions, post them to the Q&A forums. I'm always happy to help you out. Okay, hopefully you now have an idea of what's possible with the forms in Bootstrap, and that you're going to be using class form-group a lot whenever you're actually dictating that you have a form there. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.